My Govanen. Welcome to Tolkien Lore Channel. I'm the Tolkien Geek, and in this video I'm going to talk about something that I've wanted to do for a while and I've had a few requests for as well, and that is the tale of Aldarion and Erendis, or also known as the tale of the Mariner's Wife. And it's interesting because the wife in this story is not per se the protagonist, but in a lot of the ways she's kind of the defining element of the story. But it's a really interesting story in that it is set in Numenor in the Second Age, and it's really the only well-developed story out of Numenor that we get from Tolkien anywhere. We have kind of a broad history of the Second Age in the Silmarillion, in the story of the Akalabaith, but other than a broad history of Numenor, we don't get much of anything out of the Second Age. There is another unfinished story about the Second Age, which Tolkien began, but that's a totally separate thing for another video. This story is about one of the kings of Numenor and certain parts of his life, and of course this is in the Unfinished Tales, which means it was never actually finished, but we do get pretty far into the story and a pretty good idea of where it might go. So let's get a start and see what we think. The basic plot line of this story begins with Tar Meneldur, who is the fourth king of, or rather the son of the fourth king, I think, of Numenor, and it tells us a little bit about him before it gets to Aldarion, who is his son. And it tells us that he is, wise, a thoughtful person, not very active in terms of, feats of body. He is much more of a thinker than a doer, and his real passion is for observing the stars, and so he spends a lot of time before he becomes king in the northern parts of Numenor, where there's a tower where he can observe the stars. Once he becomes king, of course, he moves to the capital and spends less time there, but goes there as much as he can. He becomes king, and he has this son who is named Anardil, but eventually is also known as Aldarion, and that's how he is known in all the stories. And his son is in some ways like him, but he is much more proud and has a rather not so useful trait of being very willing to push back on basically anything like advice. If somebody tells him you should do this, he's probably going to do the opposite, and that becomes kind of a running theme through this story. His son, grows up pretty fast in terms of like his skill and his ability to do things, and for a long time his father just kind of lets him do what he wants, and he spends a lot of time near the ships and the sea yards and all that sort of thing. He's very taken with all this, and for that reason his mother's father, his maternal grandfather, actually takes a great liking to Aldarion. And for his coming of age birthday, he says, I want to take you on a voyage across the sea to meet Gil-galad and others, in Middle-earth, take you out of Numenor for a trip. And so he tells him, talk to your dad about this. So Aldarion takes this to his dad, and he, asks for leave to go. And Meneldur is like, I have a bad feeling about this, but he eventually gives in. And so he does, in fact, let him go. And ever after this voyage, Aldarion is completely obsessed with the life of a mariner, wants to be, on ships all the time and all that sort of thing. And a lot of the early part of this story is talking about things that he does. And I'm going to give like the really short, condensed version of this story. There's a lot of really interesting things that happen, but just to kind of sum up his career, you could say that he becomes a really great shipbuilder. He does a lot of voyaging to Middle-earth, and he also becomes a really major proponent of making sure there's plenty of trees in Numenor, because he wants to make sure that there's enough to replace what they use for ships. So he's not doing ships and not thinking about the consequences elsewhere. He's actually very prudent in thinking forward. However, his obsession, you might say, with the mariner's life gets his father a little bit upset, because it's, he's constantly gone from Numenor. He's not seemingly ever going to get married, and he worries that he's not going to produce an heir and that the line will die out, and it'll have to, pass to an adjacent line or something like that. So this becomes an issue of strife between him and his son, and this comes up several times. In his voyages to Middle-earth, he does establish ports and havens and things like that, and some of them will end up becoming places that survive into the Third Age when Elendil and his sons return to Middle-earth after the downfall of Numenor. But a lot of the stuff that he does, we don't really know a whole lot of detail about at first. At any rate, one of the voyages he comes back from, and his father is really, kind of pushing him to stay or whatever, and it just so happens that one of his more distant relatives, who is a female, is, now in the household of the queen, and they meet, and she takes an instant liking to him. He, he doesn't have anything against her or anything like that, but he's not, enamored of her at this point. But things do develop over time, and at one point he decides that he's going to leave again on a journey, and his father is like, no, I'm putting my foot down. I don't want you to go this time. He can't outright forbid him, but in Numenor there was this custom that whenever a ship leaves, one of the family members of the captain would take a wreath and place it on the ship as basically a blessing. And so his father, Beneldur, basically forbids anybody in the family from taking the wreath and putting it on the ship. Well, Erendis, who is the woman that is, rather taken with him, shows up and brings a wreath. She's not really within the band because she's not in the family. And so she shows up and puts the wreath on there. And it's kind of at this point that he starts taking kind of a serious interest in her. Well, anyway, he goes off on this voyage, and he's gone for a fairly long time. Now, while he's gone a lot of this time, Erendis' family is also kind of talking to her on the backside, and his father is talking to Erendis. And there's some talk about the fact that, you're not of the line of Elros, and therefore you're going to have a much shorter life than he is. It's, this may not be the best match. But she really wants to marry him, and she also realizes that because of his love for the sea, that she is going to have to basically be at war with his life as a mariner. It's like, she wants to conquer the sea as if it's a rival mistress. So this is kind of in the back of her mind. At any rate, he ends up coming back, and at some point, he eventually really starts to take an interest in her as a wife, and they start talking about this very seriously. And there are even points where in the story where he considers the idea of giving up on the mariner's life because he thinks he might actually be content just living with her. And there are hints in the story that if things had gone a little bit differently, maybe that actually would have worked out. But anyway, he eventually comes back. His father actually ends up reconciling with him. This actually kind of happens like 2 or 3 times in the story. They get mad, they reconcile, they get mad, they reconcile. But he comes back and stays for a good long while and is, kind of planning to get married. But he doesn't quite do it yet. And that starts to cause concern, and concern on the part of his father, because he's like, what are you waiting for? And concern on the part of Erendis, who is like, I don't have forever. You're going to live a lot longer than I am. I'm not going to live that long. We need to kind of do something soon. But at any rate, it finally does happen. And then, unfortunately, because of the tension between him and his father, who he perceives as being very much in Erendis' camp and against him, which is probably at least partially due to his own stubbornness, but also partially due to, well, we'll kind of get to that at the end, actually. There's reasons. But anyway, there's, back and forth. He eventually decides he's going to go sailing again, and he ends up, in fact, going on a really long voyage, and he intends it to be short, but it ends up not being very short. And in this voyage, in fact, and I'm skipping over a lot of details here, so don't come back and act like I'm trying to say all this in exact, this is all the events. I'm skipping over some of the voyages because there's a bunch. So all you people in the comments who are like, you left out, I know, I'm giving the short version. He goes on this one particularly long voyage where the wreath that was placed, which by the way was not placed by Erendis because she was not too happy, it ends up withering before they get back. And this is a thing that never happened before. And it's like, that's kind of a bad sign. But he was gone a long time, partially because the weather was against him, which is also unusual for Numenorian ships. Numenor had been blessed by the Valar. The Valar were particularly, and Uinen, who was one of the Maya, Maiar under Ulmo particularly blessed Numenor in the sense that she kind of protected their ships. But they had storms and all these other things, and it's like there's omens that don't really look good in some of the things that are happening, and he comes back and the wreath is withered. By the time he gets back from kind of the last major voyage, his father is really mad at him. He's been gone way longer than he promised, and Erendis now basically hates him. Like she went like 2 years out, which is when he was supposed to return. He didn't show up, and after that, she just kind of hates him. They had already had a child, a daughter, and after this happened, she basically decided, I'm going to raise my daughter out, kind of in the middle of nowhere around a bunch of shepherds, and she's not even going to see any men. It's all going to be women around me. I hate men. So she kind of takes, all of this way too personally. Not that it's necessarily hard to blame some of her anger, but, she kind of takes it to an extreme. And he comes back, and he delivers a letter to his father from Gil-galad back in Middle-earth. And his father, of course, is stern with him and says, you should have been back a long time ago, and you probably kind of ruined your relationship with your wife. And, they have some harsh words. He goes off to look for Erendis and takes a few people with him and eventually comes to where they're staying. And in meeting with Erendis and also his daughter, who doesn't really recognize him at this point because she was so young when he left, and it's been so many years, he has a conversation with her, which is, very meaningful and telling of where his heart is. And you can tell, too, it's interesting in the conversations that he has, he wants to reconcile, but he's too proud to give in too much. So there's a lot of stuff in this story about how the pride of human beings can really get in our own way. It's really fascinating study in psychology in a lot of ways. But anyway, it becomes clear he's not going to get anywhere with them, and so he basically just leaves, eventually comes back to the capital where his father is. And in the meantime, his father had read the letter, and the letter is one of the most interesting parts of this story. It's got nothing to do with Erendis, but it does kind of give us a little bit of a backhand view at some of the things that went on earlier, because the letter is from Gil-galad, and he basically says, thanks for sending your son over here so many times. We've really needed his help, and it's really been awesome because, in not so many words, but he basically says Sauron is rising in power again, and he's becoming a real threat, and your son being here with, help from Numenor and whatnot has really made it a little bit more comfortable for us, and we're hopeful that you can keep sending this aid in the future. And his father, reading this letter is like, whoa, I did not know that. And it makes you wonder, like, how much of this conversation was ever had before between Meneldur and Aldarion, and to the extent that it wasn't had before, was it not had simply because the two couldn't see eye to eye and they never got there? It's not really clear when you go back and look at the rest of the story through the lens of this. It's really interesting. But because of reading this letter, Meneldur comes to the decision that I don't know enough about any of this to make a wise decision, and so I am going to hand the throne down to Aldarion, and he can make the decisions. And it was customary in Numenor for these really long-lived kings to give up the rule prior to dying. It was a normal thing. They would, with 100 years or so maybe left in their lives, would give the rule over to their son, who by that point had come to full age and was really ready to rule. Meneldur did it earlier than average, substantially, because he realized, at least in his own mind, he was thinking, I don't have the knowledge or wisdom that I need to make this kind of decision. And he recognizes, too, that, by giving him the rule and letting him decide, I'm kind of deciding, because I know what he's going to do. But, that's the position he finds himself in. And it's really interesting because, again, it shows you the kind of that psychology, like how much might things have been very different had the two been a little more, had Aldarion not been quite as prideful, and had Meneldur been a little more patient maybe and tried to actually figure out what was going on. But at any rate, that's the decision he makes, and Aldarion becomes king, and the story kind of ends right around there. There's a little bit more, and then there's some notes that indicate kind of where the story might go from there. Some of which has to do with the idea that, Aldarion basically proclaims himself, I don't have a wife. I'm basically a widower. Won't acknowledge Erendis, but the daughter does end up being the heir. And the daughter is a little bit too savvy for her own good, because she plays the two parents against each other. She kind of skips back and forth. She'll live in the capital, and then she'll live with Erendis, and there's ideas there of what her path might be like, but we never get like a full account of what Aldarion might have done in terms of helping Gil-galad and all that sort of thing. So we never get a real resolution of that, and that would have been interesting to see too, because the way that we do see the Numenorian story play out, the main thrust of Numenor versus Sauron comes much, much later in the Second Age. And it's like, what happened, if Aldarion was doing all this in the early days, what kind of happened with all that? So there's some minor hints in there about that, but nothing really substantive. And you get the idea that the daughter, would have totally rejected Aldarion's policies and whatnot anyway, once she eventually took the throne. So anyway, that's kind of the broad brushstrokes of the story. So like I said, one of the interesting things about this story is the psychological aspect. It's very heavy in terms of, the play between Aldarion and Erendis, and Aldarion and his father, and other players besides. And there's, I didn't even touch on the fact that Aldarion started this whole group called the Guild of Venturers, who were, they were all kind of well loved by the populace at large, which kind of didn't help Meneldur in his position, because it's like the more he pushed against Aldarion, the less popular he would have become. But there's like all kinds of stuff going on in the background, but the psychology of the players, and how they interact is one of the key things in this story, and that's kind of unique for Tolkien. He does a lot of stories, but he doesn't do a lot of stories where the personalities and psychologies really make such a huge impact on what happens. And so it's a very different kind of story for Tolkien to tell. It's also, of course, like I said, interesting just for the fact that it's one of the few stories we get out of the Second Age, and really the only extended story we get out of Numenor. And the other interesting thing about it, too, is it gives us a really interesting glimpse into the way Numenorian culture kind of changed, how they became a really major shipbuilding power, because that was not originally something they were really good at. But looking at it through the lens of this story, we can kind of see that Aldarion is kind of the one who really pushed that move to where Numenorians literally sailed all over the world. So there's interesting aspects of it there too. It fills in, not explicitly, because it's kind of, you have to put two and two together in your own brain, reading the Akalabaith and reading this story, but if you do, you can kind of see that's where probably all of this got started. But the other really interesting thing to me about this story is just the fact that it's so, like I said, so different in terms of psychology, but also so unique in terms of, the really unique thing about it is it's really Tolkien's only failed marriage. In the entirety of all Tolkien's stories, there's no single coupling of, two people that ends up being such a colossal failure as this one. They almost always end up as complete successes. You do have some that are like, you could maybe say is a gray area, like Thingol and Melian. That works really well for a while, and then Thingol kind of gets a little too greedy for his own good. But that's not really a falling apart of the marriage per se. Here, we actually have two people who get married, and it just does not work out at all. Most of Tolkien's, love stories end up being very successful, happy ending type stories. You've got Beren and Luthien, Aragorn and Arwen. You've got these love stories that end up being big deal. Now, you do have the exception, of course, of Turambar, who ends up marrying his own sister. But that's a different, that's a different category altogether. But, most of and the thing is with Turin, it's not even a love story per se. It's a thing that happens to him because of the bad circumstances of his own life. But you know, the love stories and the ones where we get marriages as being like a central part of the story, they don't tend to end this way with Tolkien, and this is the only time we really see that happening. And it's really interesting because you have to wonder what was going through Tolkien's mind. Why did he want to write this story about a marriage? And I mean, the title of the story itself is about the marriage. It's Aldarion and Erendis, the mariner's wife. Why does he write this particular story in this particular way? It's really interesting to think about from that perspective too. But anyway, those are kind of my general thoughts about the story and the story itself, so I'll leave it there. So hope you enjoyed that video. Hope you got some interesting insights into some additional stuff in Tolkien's world, that, you know, the history of Numenor and all that stuff. It gives us a really interesting lens through which to look through. So hope you enjoyed that. And if you have any other ideas on the significance of this story, or if you think I left out any crucial details, like I said, I was doing a really broad brush because it's kind of a longish story, and every part of it is important at some level. But if you want to talk about some of the other stuff in there, please do leave them in the comments below. It could be some really interesting conversation because it is a deep, deep story for considering how short it is page-wise. But anyway, if you did give it, if you do like it, then please give it a thumbs up, share it around. If you want to see more of my stuff, you can of course subscribe to the channel here, and you can support the channel here, and you can find 2 of my previous videos here. Until the next time, I'm the Tolkien Geek, signing out for the Tolkien Lore channel. Namaste.